Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for being here. I've sat by this graph all afternoon, and I've studied it, and I wanted to comment on it because
you're the only one who can read it.
You've referenced it several times today, and you've come to some conclusions that I think are flawed, and here's why. I spent some time on the MMS OCS 5-year planning subcommittee, where we looked at oil and natural gas leases and came up with recommendations for the next 5-year plan on where those leases would be granted. And it struck me during the time that the only areas that we could even talk about within that committee was Deepwater, Western GOM, and Deepwater, Alaska. And near shore, the 1,000-foot and shallower areas on that grid were off limits for us to even talk about for the next 5-year period. And so when you see an increase of activity in deepwater exploration and production, I think it's directly attributable to the fact that policies of the United States government has pushed oil exploration and production away from the shore, away from the marshes and the rivers and other things to deep water. So I think some of the conclusions you've come to based on that chart that you've referenced are flawed. So I want to make those comments. And Mr. Chairman, I hope that us on the E&M subcommittee or this committee will continue to look at the policies that are in place that pushed it to deep water and continue to look at nearshore, onshore, and other resources going forward. A couple of questions for you based on your report that are on a whole different line of thinking, so bear with me. In your report, you provide a short review of the firefighting efforts in response to the disaster. And I want to commend the guys that went out there on the rescue effort with our Coast Guard and others. And this line of questioning has no bearing on their efforts. But the lack of attention to this critical part of the disaster has left many of us confused. In the report, you state that others are going to study this issue more completely. Can you tell me first, and there's going to be 3 questions here, can you tell me first, in your opinion, if you believe the firefighting efforts were properly coordinated? That's number one. The second thing, many believe that firefighting contributed to the sinking of the rig. Was there a possibility of saving the rig? And would the rig not sinking have permitted the subsea blowout that we saw? Was there a possibility to let the oil continue burn and work on shutting off the flow of oil that was the source of fuel for the fire? Or was the structural integrity of that rig in jeopardy anyway? So if you could answer those, in either one.
Well, I said that one of the lessons learned was that we were very ill prepared to respond, particularly in the critical first hours and days of this. And I would suggest that that included our ability to restrain fire under these circumstances. If I could, I'd like to go back to your first comments. I think you ought to also look at the issue of depletion. We've been heavily mining for oil and gas, the shallow water, since 1938. Continue to do so today. I believe that these charts are as much a function of the reality that most of where the oil is today, the so-called elephants of offshore oil, are not at 1,000 feet. They're more likely to be at 5,000 or 10,000 feet, and that's why that's where the industry is moving. But that might be a question that your subcommittee could examine as to what are the factors that have gone.
We'll pursue that at a later time. Let's get back to the firefighting efforts and what may have attributed to, because that's a lot of questions in my district and around South Carolina and across the land that I've heard. So do you think the firefighting efforts were coordinated? Do you think that the rig could have sat there and burned until we shut off the flow of oil underwater? And the structural integrity of the rig, was it in jeopardy? Do you have any input on that?
The only thing I would say, without wanting to characterize a lot of activities that occurred in the chaos of the fire and the response, is that there were moments at various times when well control could still possibly have been established, when even the gases that were rising in the drill pipe could have been diverted over the side and perhaps not come into contact with an ignition source and not caught fire, but that once the fire began, when we looked at transcripts of reports of what it was like on that rig and how it seemed like a jet airplane or a fast-moving train had just come out of the drill pipe, I'm not sure that there was a great deal that could have been done that would have averted the disaster that did occur. It does occur to us, however, that the degree to which the response to the emergency immediately was characterized by a lot of chaos of one of the rescue boats leaving a number of people still on the rig who then jumped into the water and did in fact survive, the people who made that choice, and then discovered those who were in the evacuation boat that they couldn't get away from the rig as it looked like it was going to topple on them, and they discovered it was because that they were tethered by a rope and no one has or was allowed to have a knife on the rig, so they had to look for a means of severing the rope. It didn't appear to us, and I think the documentation supports this, that there had been the kind of drills, simulations, practices that would have been appropriate, and I think probably will be insisted upon in the industry in the future. And that is one more change that needs to occur that we have really learned the lesson from.
Do you think the rig would have continued burning? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.